In this mini presentation, we want to look at Morale section on contemporary issues in missions. Chapter 16 starts this part with an overview of cross-cultural communications, a critical foundation for encountering the many cultures of the world. Chapter 17 then surveys contemporary issues in mission in general, especially issues not already covered in the rest of the book. Communication is vitally important to the work of missionaries. So here are 5 foundational truths about communication. First, everything that we do communicates. Secondly, the goal of communication is always more than just to impart information. The communication process is more complex than most people realize. The communication process is dynamic, not static. And lastly, developing communication patterns that build trust is an invaluable missionary skill. Our communication is clothed in culture. These 3 ideas will help you understand cultural tensions. Every human being is, to a large extent, a product of cultural values. Like individuals, cultures are not static, they are dynamic and always changing. People always interpret your words and actions through the grid of their worldview. Our communication, and our culture for that matter, are shaped by the deeply held hidden beliefs that we have about our world, sometimes called our worldview. Simply put, our worldview is our view of the world, and it is at the seat of most of our ideas of what should be and should not be. So the authors give a good basic definition of a worldview. A worldview is a set of belief systems that defines the way we lean into life. It gives us a mental map by which we read everything that happens around us, and it's also the set of rules by which we construct the mental map. Direct and indirect communication are a bit difficult to understand. Direct communication comes in a low context setting where the meaning of a message is derived from verbal communication. On the other hand, indirect communication comes in a culture where the message is not directly stated. Instead, it's understood from the context. It's understood from high context clues, rather, that are around us. So in general, Western cultures are low context cultures, and majority world cultures are high context cultures. Perhaps this makes it a little bit more understandable. In direct communication, the words used are central to understanding the message being communicated. Verbal openness is more important than protecting feelings or saving face. It does not value beating around the bush. In indirect communication, the context in which words are used is central to understanding the message being communicated. It does not cause loss of face by communicating negative messages directly, and values reading the thoughts or intentions of the other without having to be told directly what they are. It values those things. Another classic lens through which we look at culture is that of time. There are certain differences between polychronic and monochronic cultures. So time is a reality for every culture. Our families and societies give each of us a rule book that tells us how we're to perceive time and its importance in relationships. Social time, as opposed to pure clock time, has been called the heartbeat of culture. More than simply regulating seasons and days, social time is an integral part of every interaction in life. In monochronic cultures, time is viewed as a commodity available in limited amounts. Discrete units of time, seconds, minutes, hours, each have value, and we value others by valuing their time. Important cultural values include privacy, promptness, and the idea that schedules need to be kept because they help us live more efficiently. In polychronic cultures, time is viewed as a point where you are and is not easily sliced into separate pieces. The value of a person determines how you handle time with them. And so cultural values include multi-level, simultaneous involvement. No one really is excluded because of time. Interruptions are simply part of the rhythm of life, and promptness is defined by the relationship, not the clock. A third lens in culture is that of individualism versus collectivism, and there are ways that we orient ourselves in our relationship to others. So the collectivist wants to fit in and belong to the group, develop skills early in life that enable him or her to blend into the group by changing behavior and to some extent even personality so that they don't stand out. On the other hand, the individualist is taught to be unique and not simply follow the crowd. They see conforming to group values as hypocritical and values being him or herself, whatever pressures even the group might bring on them. Cultures are more collectivist or individualist. So collectivist cultures are belonging. They value fitting in or occupying one's proper place, engaging in appropriate actions, etc. On the other hand, individualist cultures value being unique, expressing oneself, promoting one's own goals, etc. Here are some important clues to the way the people in collectivist cultures might say no without actually using the word itself. They might use silence or avoid direct responses. There might be hesitation or postponement. They might blame a third party or other circumstances, and they might accept an invitation without acting on it. Conflict is handled differently in individualist and collectivist cultures. So, in individualistic cultures, they might tend to have more conflict, whereas in collectivists, they might have less. In individualists, they might generally be confined to individuals, and it might have less of an effect on the group, whereas in a collectivist culture, it might involve the entire group, and the effect might impact more people. Cross-cultural communication really is no easy thing. Crossing cultures and effectively communicating God's call to worship is tricky. The annals of missionary history are full of shipwrecks that happened simply because the lines of communication were crossed and misunderstandings escalated to the point where relationships were eventually broken. So, what should we do? We should find appropriate training in intercultural communication, even if you have no intention of becoming a missionary. And in our increasingly globalized culture, the ability to navigate cultural differences successfully is no longer an option. We need to learn how to work with others who are different from us. So we now move to missions trends and paradigm shifts. And the first involves this idea of the short-term emphasis that characterizes missions. So for many years, it's been assumed that people who go on short-term missions are more likely to come back as career missionaries. The fact, however, is that there has been a tremendous upsurge in short-term missionary workers without any corresponding increase in the ranks of long-term missionaries. So it appears that this original assumption was incorrect. We can talk about the pros and cons of short-term missions, and some of the cons are that career missionaries can be sidetracked by having to watch over really loud, brash groups of young people who are insensitive to the culture and unaware of the images that they project. Another con is that it can literally take years to undo damage done by more extreme groups who don't take into account the realities of culture and the expectations that they bring. And here are some of the pros of short-term missions work. So short-term projects not only can be a healthy vehicle for people to consider long-term service, or the idea of that, but also, in the best of cases, they can assist long-term missionaries or nationals in completing significant projects for God's kingdom that otherwise might not have been done. So the authors, they move on to share 10 commandments for short-term missionaries. And you can read them here, and I'll pause to let you look at them. Have you ever wondered why short-term missions are so popular? According to the authors, above all else, the enormous popularity of short-term missions is a reflection of local churches' desire to be involved more directly in global missions. So the tidal wave of short-term missions is also a reflection of the cultural reality that relationships and choice, rather than authority and institutional loyalty, now effectively rule the day. And so we want to be involved, we want to be engaged, and so we're choosing to move in that direction. We should remember that short-term missions are largely the product of particularly wealthy and mobile historical contexts. So change the attendant conditions, and essentially the methods will change. So short-term missions, both within the agency rubric and the more direct church-to-church variety, are not going away anytime soon. They're part of the condition of our day. Another issue to be aware of is the tension between churches and agencies. So churches, especially the larger ones, are pulling back from unquestioning support of the agendas and methodologies of established missions agencies. And missionaries are being sent out directly by local churches, often bypassing agencies altogether. It is possible, given right attitudes and clear thinking, to see healthy synergism rule the day, wherein churches and agencies work together not only in implementation but also in setting agendas in conjunction with believers in a region so that they can accomplish things that none of them could achieve on their own. Another important issue in missions is the idea of financing. So almost $3 billion was given to American agencies for overseas missions in 1999, an increase of more than 21% from 1996 to 99, even after adjusting for inflation. And that increase was really very broad-based. Here is some perspective. The same year, Americans spent $6.1 billion on computer video games. And Burger King sales during that time exceeded $10 billion. So what are the long-term prospects for financing missions? Will giving generosity rise and fall with the economy? We're seeing the retirement and death of a generation that was more financially committed, and the transfer of wealth to a generation known for its greed rather than its generosity is upon us. What will that mean? The core problem appears to be a scandal of evangelical heart in North America. So according to our authors, God's people increasingly seem to love the world and seek its approval more than they love and seek the approval of the Savior. Additionally, the relative cost of financing missionaries from the West versus missionaries from the rest of the world has caught the attention of many agencies and church mission committees in the United States. Another paradigm shift is the surge of majority world missions. And here are some things to keep in mind. U.S. agencies are becoming more international. Majority world mission agencies and missionaries are exploding, but not always following traditional Western models of support. And this explosion is not under the control of anyone but God, and it's a cause for great rejoicing. Another recent development is the establishment of partnerships. These partnerships are often official agreements between Western churches and majority world churches, mission fields, or even missionaries. So these partnerships involve creating and carrying out partnerships in which each member is valued and has something to offer to the partnership. They're difficult under the best of circumstances. Really, never before in modern history has there been such a high level of interagency cooperation, both within and across cultures. This has been facilitated in part by the shift in emphasis, especially in the West, from those denominational theological loyalties to ministry and philosophy loyalties. Here are some mistakes that partners make. You might want to save this page for the future. First of all, we assume that we're all alike. We promise more than we can deliver. We set out without a roadmap. We underestimate cultural differences. We take shortcuts. We forget to develop self-reliance. And we run a race with no end. Another paradigm shift is the focus on spiritual warfare. What is spiritual warfare? It's the struggle Christians have to live faithful Christian lives in the face of onslaughts of spiritual powers and of darkness. So missionary training in evangelical circles in the West largely ignored issues of spiritual warfare until the early 1980s. The focus with many who teach spiritual warfare is on the need for the missionary or evangelist to be equipped to face Satan's attacks. There is also personal spiritual warfare. However we answer the question of Satan's ability to affect believers, the New Testament warns to humble ourselves before God and be on our guard so that we can resist Satan and stand our ground in the face of his attacks. And make it clear that Christians are not immune to his attacks. Scripture seems to make that quite clear. So there's also personal ministry in spiritual warfare. So in addition to being prepared to face spiritual warfare in their own lives, they need preparation in ways to minister to the harassed and helpless whom they encounter. And so several approaches to spiritual warfare have been developed. There's outright confrontation of demons. There's engaging truth in the life of the believer, bringing God's power to bear through visualization techniques, etc. There's also what has been called strategic spiritual warfare, and some have more recently advocated that a key element in missionary ministry is the confrontation and binding of spirits who are responsible for territories rather than individuals. So Peter Wagner has called this strategic level spiritual warfare. And associated with is the practice of spiritual mapping, in which Christians seek to discover through a combination of research and prayer the spirits controlling a geographic domain so that they can more effectively pray for those areas and combat the territorial spirits there. And the final paradigm shift has been the explosion of technology and the ocean of information that is at hand. So we have access to quantities of information through these means: email, CDs, computers, the internet, mobile phones, texting, etc. So we can see that contemporary issues in missions are important, that our culture is influencing the way we engage in missions in this day, and we need to be prepared to face those issues.